Okay, good morning and welcome to this Living Streets Wales. My name is Mary Creagh and I'm Chief Executive of Living Streets, the UK charity for everyday walking. Just watching the buttons, I think we've got um, around 50 participants on the seminar with us today. So this event is an opportunity to discuss the benefits that school street schemes bring to families walking to school and to the communities around schools. School streets create space for walking and cycling, and they close the road to cars, encouraging more active travel to school. They also make it lovely and quiet and make that school journey just a little bit less stressful. They've been successfully implemented across the UK, and Living Streets has taken an active role in ensuring several important projects have been implemented. We ensure that the community understands the benefits of school streets and their projects are enforced effectively. Local authorities have many targets that school streets can help with, including better road safety, air quality, livability, and public health. These contribute to the Wales Wellbeing Goals, which Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, Sophie Howe, will talk about in a moment. It's an important time for active travel in Wales as the Welsh Government is revising its transport strategy and has recently published its Clean Air Plan. It's time to reimagine Wales's streets, towns and cities as places for people to live active and healthy lives. And the Active Travel Wales Act and the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act compel us to do so. As part of the firebreak announced this week in Wales, primary and secondary schools up to year 8 will remain open after half term, making the need for safe and effective physical distancing more important than ever. Outdoor exercise will still be permitted under the national lockdown, and as school streets make it easier for families to walk or cycle to schools, councils in Wales, including Cardiff Council, are now rolling out school street schemes. So it's vital that we make more space for walking if we're going to tackle our twin epidemics of obesity and loneliness in our country. Every child should have the right to walk safely to school and to enjoy the fun, fitness and freedom that walking brings. So today I'm delighted to be joined by our illustrious panel of speakers. We have Sophie Howe, who is the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, Dafydd Trystan Davies, Chair of the Wales Active Travel Board, Caro Wilde, Cabinet Member for Strategic Planning and Transport at Cardiff Council, Sarah Rees, Campaigns Manager at Pregnant Then Screwed, and Chris Thompson, Project Manager for Schools at Living Streets, Scotland. It's great to have you all here with us today. We'll start off with hearing from our panel. Each will talk about the importance of the walk to school and talk through every angle of a school street scheme, from a national wellbeing policy right through to community engagement and the technical know-how for delivering them successfully. After this, at around 12:30, I'll put your questions to the panel. We have had some questions in advance, but please do use the Q&A button or the chat buttons at the bottom to put your questions to the panel. So the Q&A function is on the bottom right for those of you who are using Zoom for the first time, which I'm sure is not very many people. Before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to share a short video highlighting a school street scheme in Cardiff. Sarah will now play that for us. Sorry, there's no audio, but we do have subtitles, so I think it's quite useful to read and to listen to the children. Okay, so that was the welcome to the world of the Shonky video. We did that. I think it's a frequent issue with Zoom, so we will have a look at that, and we will share the video with you afterwards. But basically, this is something that we did in Cardiff, and I hope it'll inspire us to think about starting a school streets scheme. We do have a school streets toolkit, which acts as a useful guide to help schools, parents and carers take action to make their school streets safer. And this, as of today, this toolkit is also available in Welsh. We've shared the links to both toolkits in the chat function. They will also be distributed after today's event. So hopefully a useful tool, and certainly the communications piece, working with residents before it's introduced. A school street that I was visiting last month with the minister in Hackney said that they had a slight grace period. So for the first offence of people driving down, they didn't tend to issue the fine, but then so there was a little bit of flexibility to help embed that behaviour change. So we'll move now to our first guest speaker, Sophie Howe, the world's first and only Future Generations Commissioner. Sophie took up the post in 2016 and has led very high profile interventions around transport planning, education reform and climate change. As part of her role, she provides advice to Welsh Government and other public bodies and assesses how they're delivering the wellbeing goals of the landmark Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. I'm pleased now to invite Sophie to talk about the importance of school streets and how they can help deliver these wellbeing goals. Sophie, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mary. As you've heard there, obviously I'm responsible for overseeing the implementation of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which I'm sure many of you, particularly those of you joining from Wales, will be only too aware of. And, it is still internationally groundbreaking. There's no other country in the world that has set out this aspiration to, and a legal requirement to take decisions in a way which meets today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And also set out these 7 interconnected well-being goals, these long-term goals about the Wales that we want to leave behind to our children and our grandchildren. They're connected back to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, so we're doing our piece as a kind of globally responsible country. But I suppose in essence, what the Act requires us to do is to find the things that are going to maximise the contribution to each one of those 7 wellbeing goals. And those goals cover a range of things, but they talk about us having a low carbon society. They talk about us focusing on people's physical and mental health and keeping them well rather than just treating them when they're ill. They talk about cohesive and connected communities. They talk about a more equal Wales. They talk about a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language. And I think that living streets and school streets in particular really does have a contribution to make to each one of those wellbeing goals. When we think about the fact that 14% of our carbon emissions are transport-related emissions, when we think of the huge challenges we've got in terms of obesity, so in Wales, 58% of the adult population are overweight or obese, and perhaps even more worryingly, 26% of children. When we think about the fact that last year, police forces across Wales reported almost 6,000 casualties from road accidents across Wales, and we know that air pollution accounts for around 2,000 deaths in Wales. So you can see how focusing on living streets, on embedding a culture of active travel, of walking, cycling or scooting to school from an early age, and getting parents doing that as well, can make a significant contribution to each one of these goals. And I think certainly, you know, it takes leadership to implement some of these things, and they're often not popular initially, but, you know, change, people are, you know, creatures of habit, and often they don't like change until it happens and until they see how much better things can be. There was a report in the Guardian today showing 26% of people support low traffic neighbourhoods, and 31% of people tend to. So that's tipping the balance there of the majority of the public actually being in support of that. But of course, when you then go to implement things locally, it can sometimes be challenging, which is why we need that leadership from our politicians, both locally, and I'm really pleased that Caro is here going to be speaking later, because certainly we've seen that leadership from him in Cardiff. I think we're starting to see that leadership at a Welsh Government level, and some of the challenges that I've been levelling to the government are, you can't on the one hand declare a climate emergency and put in extra resources to tackling that climate emergency, and then on the other hand have about 70% of your infrastructure budget going to spend on roads to service cars. That actually has to shift, and I think we're beginning to see that shift happening, and COVID, I think, is perhaps fast forwarding a number of those things, and I'm going to say a little bit about that in a moment. But I've also been fortunate to be a parent who is a recipient of the benefits of school streets. So my children's school was closed off as part of the School Streets scheme, actually just at the beginning of the year. And of course, you know, and that wasn't in response to COVID, it was prior to COVID, it was part of the sort of longer term plan that the council is implementing. There were some gripes and some concerns, but overwhelmingly, I think people have absolutely embraced the position that we now find ourselves in. And what is absolutely fascinating is how that combined with the new ways of living and working that we're seeing post-COVID, so increased home working, people sort of, you know, focusing on the hyper-local, people perhaps having a bit more time because they're not doing the commute to work and so on. So we're seeing massively increased rates of walking and cycling to school. The parents that I'm stopping to have a chat with are less stressed. I can see mums cycling with their kids who've never done that before. And I think the interesting combination is how there's never just one silver bullet. You know, you have to have a combination here, I think, of closing the streets so driving down them is not permitted. That combined with homework and giving people that little bit more time, I think has made a real significant difference. So part of the requirements of the Future Generations Act is that integrated thinking and working out if we want to get to that longer term, those longer term aspirations of meeting the 7 wellbeing goals, what are the different policies, perhaps in some less obvious areas that we might need to put in place. And some of the things that I reflect on is I've got 5 children. My eldest is 21, my youngest is 6. And when I was taking my 21-year-old to school, when he first started, I was going in the car, I was, dashing to work to get there for 9 o'clock. Or to get to the childminders and so on. And there's a range of different policies now which have changed all of that for the better. So even prior to COVID, even prior to the school street implementation, I was able, because of flexible working regulations that have come in, and that now becoming the norm, reflecting on the bus on the way to work, that actually the bus at 9:15 from Whitchurch High Street is full of parents from school, and that just wouldn't have been the case 15 or so years ago. So that policy in terms of flexible working, those policies in terms of breakfast clubs, in terms of after school clubs, actually have a positive knock-on consequence to the ability of parents to travel differently to reduce their carbon emissions. And so I think what we now need to be doing is, never waste a good crisis. COVID has exposed a huge number of challenges, not least the decline in public transport. But I think we now need to see mass implementation of school streets to really embed that culture whilst we can, whilst people are working from home and are likely to continue working from home, of walking, scooting, cycling to school. I think
we need to leave it there. That's a brilliant introduction, but I'm just conscious of time, and we need to. Sorry, Sophie, to cut you off, but we need to move on to our next speaker, if that's okay. We will have questions and answers, so please put your questions to Sophie in the Q&A, not the chat box. Sorry, that's my fault. Right, it's my great pleasure now to introduce Dafydd Trystan Davies, the new chair of the Active Travel Board in Wales, recently appointed to the role by the Deputy Minister for Economy and Transport, Lee Waters. This is the first time the board has had an independent chair. Dafydd previously was an advisory board member of Sustrans in Wales and a director of Cycle Training Wales, and as chair of governors of Ysgol oh dear, in Cardiff. He helped develop one of the most radical school travel plans in the UK. Dafydd will now tell us how to pronounce the name of that school and how in his new role he will prioritise walking to school and school streets. Dafydd, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mary. It's Ysgol, and it's always one to remind those who may not be first language Welsh speakers that the is kind of like I don't like it rather than e. So that's a good pointer for the future. I was almost tempted to encourage you to let Sophie carry on speaking there, because she was making many of the points that I'd make, and reflecting the fact that changing patterns of behaviour towards active travel is a complex, multifaceted problem, and you need action across a whole range of areas to deliver that. And if you can get the different parts of the council or the government or the school structures working together, you can make some pretty radical changes to patterns of behaviour, and that's what I'd like to see. The government in Wales has set out some ambitious goals. I mean, they're talking about that sort of significant modal shift from private car use towards active travel and public transport. But in order to deliver that, there's got to be an awful lot of change on the ground, and therefore I think that school streets can play a key part in delivering that. Now, why do I say school streets? Because with where we say, oh, everyone must walk and cycle all the time, or make some sort of wild statements like that, you would undoubtedly get significant public reaction, and probably not entirely positive. On the other hand, if we begin with that very simple activity that most parents do on a daily basis of getting to school, that most parents would like to be able to do in a sustainable fashion, and support doing it in a sustainable fashion. If we can make that safe, and if we can support parents and children to travel safely to school, we can make a huge difference. You mentioned Ysgol Hamadryad there. I think from my experience with that, and it's taken a couple of years to get everything in place, and there's an awful lot of work gone into it. But we're now to a point where it's cultural to travel to the school sustainably. And not only is it having health benefits, I mean, there's clearly an environmental benefits, but we're also now see some unexpected sort of spin-off economic benefits. The local coffee shop pre-pandemic was busy with parents who just dropped their children off at school, who might then go and have a chat with some friends. There are exercise classes being set up in the local park for people who've just dropped off their children. There are other sort of classes now being offered by Community Gateway and other things. So what you've got is it's suddenly mushrooming out into the economic spheres, into the health spheres, and having those benefits right across. So I think there are, across all of those future generation goals, if you like, school streets have a significant potential to make a difference. So how do we get from where we are today to a point where school streets and active travel are the norm across Wales? So the first thing I think I'd say is that there is a Welsh transport strategy coming soon from the Welsh Government. And this is where we get to a point where we can say to the government, if you are serious about modal shift, if you are serious about changing patterns of behaviour in Wales to a more sustainable basis, that transport strategy must have aspects such as active travel as a key and core part of it. And that's a discussion we've had on the Active Travel Board, and I'm positive to see what will come from that. But having it in the strategy is one thing. The second part then is within active travel, how do we prioritise those wide range of tasks we can achieve? And my view, and it's a view I've come to since being appointed to this role in the last 2 months, is that school streets and the whole infrastructure around schools offers an excellent opportunity to make progress. So the second challenge I've kind of set myself is, are schools and active travel to schools prioritised within the active travel element of the transport strategy? And then the third thing, if they are prioritised, how is that backed up not only in transport decisions, but in decisions by the education department and by all of those who support schools? So whether it's in building new schools, or whether it's in supporting existing schools to adopt school streets. And I think there's enormous opportunities there. It's still a bugbear of mine. I see these pictures of wonderful 21st century schools, and there's almost always a large car park there, and there's almost virtually never bike parking or people cycling to the schools. And I was challenged the architects on the Hamadryad plans on this, and they said, oh, don't worry, it's only a concept piece at the moment. But it struck me as an interesting one that on the concept piece, the cars were there, but not the bikes. So there's much work to be done. But I think if we address those three questions, is active travel in the transport strategy as a key part? Within the active travel strategy, are schools and school streets prioritised? And then if they are, how is that delivered right across government and local authorities? And if we get all of those right, we can make a major change and deliver on some of those ambitious and very ambitious targets that we'd all like to set for ourselves.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Dafydd. And that's an absolutely fascinating look around the horizons and just about the default. We've got questions about developments of schools, so we'll maybe come back to that. Our next speaker is Caro Wilde. He's a councillor for the Cardiff Inner City Ward of Riverside and cabinet member at Cardiff Council with responsibility for strategic planning and transport. So hopefully he can talk about how we can join up some of these issues. In early 2020, he published Cardiff's Transport White Paper, changing the way we move around a growing city. He's going to talk to us about Cardiff's school street scheme and how it fits with the council's vision for active travel. Caro, you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, everyone. Nice to see you all. I mean, I think we can we can skip the bit about how great, you know, I assume if we're all here, we all think walking and cycling to school is the right thing to do. So we can skip that, but it is worth remembering still, and something I've reminded people all the time, that for an under 12-year-old, being involved in a road traffic accident is still the most likely cause of death for under 12-year-olds, I believe. But there's another side to this as well that I think Sophie kind of touched on, which I was reading this book, I think it might be backwards on your screen, The Invisible Woman, in my first lockdown reading list of one book. But you know, it really strikes you, doesn't it? It's to do with how you appreciate the different forms of society, how you spend money on public services, and this whole thing, we spend these huge amounts of money on traditional commuting patterns, overwhelmingly done by men, but we don't seem to spend money on the kind of day-to-day caring journeys, taking people to school, and actually relatively small amounts of money that, you know, it shows we can do with things like the things we've got now. So a kind of interesting policy drive and how we should be changing how we see our policies as well. But just to sort of set out in sort of basic terms how you know, we've just heard how good this idea is, just what we did to do it. The one thing I would say we did, and you probably heard it there, we started first, and I make no apologies, it wasn't actually a difficult political decision, some of it, because we started with schools that wanted to do this. It's not been a difficult schemes to get in so far, but starting with getting the schools to want it and to come to us, rather than us going out there putting this up on the schools. The schools were coming to us saying this is a problem we want to solve, and as fixing that was certainly a good start. We did it using experimental and temporary TROs. We started with some of the easier streets where maybe they were cul-de-sacs, albeit we're now moving on to some of the trickier ones. And it's done, a lot of it's done with CCTV technology. It's quite easy to understand. The technology's moved on a lot, I think, and it means that we can kind of filter the kind of cars you want to go in there and not want to go in there. And there's signs up and the like. There's not one size fits all. There's some smaller things we can do around, you know, simple cameras to keep people off the zigzags and things like that, if you can't quite get the full road closure in. And I would say we tie it into other things around active travel in schools as well, bike fleets, teaching kids how to cross roads safely, the WOW scheme that Living Streets have really helped us with. So all sorts of other things we do around the schools as well have gone down really well. We've now piloted 5. A few months later, I think there's now another 9 or 10 coming in, and now a massive backlog of demand of people wanting to do this. And it strikes me that, you know, when you're looking at your active travel plans, whether it's in Cardiff or anywhere in Wales, you know, it's great to link up some big sort of sexy cycle superhighways and all those kind of things. But actually, we have 150 schools or so in Cardiff. You know, they're all in communities. What a great place to start your active travel strategy for a city or a country, a rural community, is starting around your schools, for all the reasons we know in terms of young people and active travel and the journeys that those schools add to the link. And the end product, what we've got the safer streets. We've got schools now coming to us saying how great it is. We've now got schools sort of Twitter feeds telling us how amazing active travel is. You know, we never would have had that 5 years ago. It's a big thing they're proud of and focused on, and it's the education department saying how great this is. The downside, you know, joking aside, is now the demand, you know, and actually, interestingly, it's almost like our paradigm, I think it's called, of how we see things has changed. We were immune to this idea that schools and cars and kids walking to school would just happen next to each other. Now people are realizing that ain't on. So actually the complaints I get are the other way now. They complain to me, why aren't we doing more of this? Which is in a way a nice problem to have. But I'm glad to hear Sophie, Dafydd sort of giving us their backing that we're going to try and roll this out across the whole of Wales. And I'm really up for it. And I think we just need to crack on. And if there are some difficult decisions to have, we're a strong unit now, and we're on the right side of the argument. So let's get on with it.
Fantastic. And thanks for coming in under time. That's amazing. I've unset my alarm. Thank you very much indeed, Caro, for that. And thank you for your passionate support. Your point about, you know, cycle infrastructure always being seen as long distance routes. When we think of cyclists, middle-aged men in lycra, etc., I couldn't agree more passionately. And I'm really interested in the idea that you said around seeing school streets as the beginning of the cycle infrastructure, the beginning and the end points of the cycle infrastructure. Because if you can cycle to school in your local neighborhood, then you need to map those neighborhoods and join them up together. And the other thing about can we have one of those? It's a bit like controlled parking zones 20 years ago. Nobody wants them at the beginning, and then you roll them out and suddenly everyone thinks I'd like to have a school street. So our final speaker, we're going to move on now to Sarah Rees, who is the campaign manager for Pregnant Then Screwed. Sarah's passion is supporting and raising the voices of pregnant women and mothers, and she is a great supporter and friend to the Women Seeking Sanctuary advocacy group in Cardiff. Coming back to Caro's point about how money is spent and how infrastructure is designed, it's very important that the voices of women and pregnant women in particular are heard in that. She's going to talk about school streets from a parent's perspective, the growing need for flexible working, which we heard about from Sophie, key workers, parents working from home, cancellations to school transport. How has all this changed the way that our children travel to school? Sarah, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Mary. So yeah, I'm Sarah. I'm a mum to 2 children who attend 2 different schools. I have a full-time job. I'm a part-time law student, and I'm a volunteer with Pregnant Then Screwed. On top of that, every day I walk my children to school. I'm not Superwoman. I do it because of flexible working. Pregnant Then Screwed is a small charity with big achievements, and our aim is to end the motherhood penalty. At the moment, 54,000 women every year are discriminated against in the workplace. They're pushed out of work because they've pushed out a baby, and that's before COVID, homeschooling, furlough, and all those different pressures have come upon us. One of the things that I am passionate about is flexible working. But a lot of people still don't understand what it is. In reality, it's lots of different things. Flexible working can be part-time hours, condensed hours, alternative hours, job shares. In short, it's allowing employees to choose when and how they work. And one of the things that I've been saying a lot to people at the moment is right now isn't flexible working. It's forced working from home in the middle of a pandemic, and that hasn't been easy for any of us. And for me, it's the reason why walking to school is so important. You know, we're all in really difficult times, and getting outside in the fresh air is just so hugely important. And something that's been wonderful for me locally is we have a brilliant coffee guy that used to be based at the train station. You know, no one's getting the train to work anymore. So he's transformed his business, and he now brings hot coffee on a bike to the school at 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning, so we can grab a coffee and have a chat and just have that time in the community that everyone's been missing out on. Previous to the pandemic, life for a lot of us with work was almost like feeling like a battery hen. You know, the pandemic has been brilliant in the sense that it has opened the floodgates on flexible working, and that's been brilliant for disabled people, for dog walkers, for dads, you know, for morning people. In short, it's good for everyone. It isn't just for offices, NHS staff, for example, they need a physical space to go to work, but flexible working can simply be having a shift that suits their lives. It isn't that difficult. So how do we get people to go free range? I wanted to share a story about when I was a child, and there was the annual book sale. And in assembly, a teacher told us how we could ask our parents to buy us a book. So we were told we had to sell the benefits of reading and why it was really good. And I used that method, and it felt like magic. You know, there was no nagging involved. My mum bought me a book without question. And I apply that same principle to flexible working. I tell people that they have to set out their stall, say why it's good for them as an employee, and also why it's good for the employer. Sell what the benefits are. You're more productive, you're healthier, you've got better focus. For me, I know if I have had that time in fresh air and I've dropped my children to school and I know they're safe and happy, then I come home and I can focus on my job and get things done that I need to do. It's about being realistic. Monday mornings in our house are a rush. We're a bit of a slog after the weekend, but we make sure that, you know, the rest of the week we can walk to school. We just have that little bit of flexibility in our day, and be prepared. It's about being prepared at work and with your walk to school. We have all the wet weather gear in this house, and that's really essential, especially when you're in Wales. So I tell people to set out that stall and then to smash their targets with their trial. You know, those targets can be for your walk to school and for your workplace. we sit down every week and we talk about, you know, what's been the fun journey that we've had. But we also talk about, you know, how have I performed while at work, because I've had that time out in the fresh air. I've spent so much time sat in this room, in this office, and it's lovely to be able to be out and about. The benefits of walking to school are obviously, you know, it's good for the planet, but for me, it's about mental health. You know, it's really stressful, I think, to be climbing in and out of cars, you know, dealing with car seat belts and tight parking spots, you know, all of those things are really difficult. Whereas time in the fresh air and talking is so important. And really, I think we would need to encourage everyone to go free range. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Oh, sorry, I lost my button there, as can often happen. Thank you very much indeed, Sarah, for your call for us all to go free range. Last but not least, I'm going to introduce Living Street's very own Chris Thompson. He coordinates and leads on our walk to school work in Scotland, which reaches more than 1 in 10 primary school pupils and works with a range of stakeholders, including the Scottish Government, local authorities, schools and families. He's going to talk to us about School Streets projects in Scotland and the projects we have worked with there. Chris, the floor's yours.
Thank you, Mary. I've just been asked by our coordinator to keep it under 5 minutes if I can. So apologies if I'm speaking far too fast. And hello to everyone from Living Streets Scotland. Okay, so we implement Walk to School programme across Scotland with hundreds of schools. And I'm delighted to say we have now dozens of schools taking part in School Streets programmes up and down the country. I'm going to put some pictures up to distract you while I'm talking, so bear with. Let's just do this quickly. There we go. So that should, okay. So this Pikachuka is entitled Data Development and Dancing. The reason for that is I think it's really important that we bring everyone along with us, and part of that is community engagement and community consultation. You'll see there a picture from Edinburgh, in fact, one of the first school streets to operate, and for any sort of sign geeks, there's a picture of the sign down in the corner if you're missing out on the technical stuff today. Data, the first chunk of this, really, really important. Pedestrian data is greatly undervalued. It continues to be undervalued. We have copious data for traffic counters, as we mentioned, automatic traffic recognition. We have, and Sarah will be popping these links in the chat as we go. We have a study on how to use pedestrian counters and actually give value to walking in a real sense. You'll see there just some examples of what that gives us. It gives us a chance to, as a nice quote from Edinburgh City Council road safety engineer, and that tells us the value of that in implementing their programme. They took this to committee at the early stages, and it was instrumental in their sort of convincing everyone that this was a valuable addition. An unashamed plug for our own programme, WOW, our flagship programme there at the bottom, which of course has data embedded into it, children recording their journeys to school. And that was also part of the evaluation that Edinburgh City Council did to show the value of this. And importantly, it wasn't just a stop-start, it was throughout. So it was baseline before, during, and they continue it today. Development, very quickly here, 4 bullet points: research, consult, trial, and evaluate. I think the main bit I'll say from this, just to keep it brief, is don't make anything sound like it's going to be forever, because I think when you're looking at these things, a lot of talk today about trials and temporary road orders. That's really important, and that was the way that many of these programs got running. And I think on there, showing that during those trials, do something that shows the street can do more than just have traffic through it. It's really, really important. And the last one, I'm doing this at very high speed, dance. Dance till your socks come off, because once you've done it, you really want to keep the enthusiasm going. And one of the things you don't want happening is a street, and to be fair, you'll realize once you clear the traffic out of the way, that not a lot else will happen once the school peak is done, morning and afternoon. So do things in the street, and there's some links there. We actually did dance, and we danced to such good effect that there are a couple of songs available. So if you want to sort of boogie away the afternoon, do follow those links at the bottom of that slide. And just a reminder there, has been mentioned a couple of times, we have lots of documents available. I think importantly, the School Streets Guide there, that just takes through in very clear stages, as I've just shown you there, how to look ahead of things, and then through the development, and then through the sort of consolidation of the programs. And just one final thing before I nip off, at the top right there, that is a clip on the video, and there's a couple of videos up on our web pages, again links provided. That's Sheen's Primary on the south side of Edinburgh, and you'll see on there pointing at a sign, and if anyone's on this call from Edinburgh City Council, you can chip in later if you like, a sign which is not one of their signs but gets pulled out of the hedge by a granny who lives there, who wasn't happy with the way that this was operating, and for a couple of months had a bit of a standoff with the council about how she thought it could operate better, and that was the solution. So there you go, one to keep up your sleeve. And I hope I've been on time for you, Mary.
You have 40 seconds to spare. There will be a small non-cash prize, Chris. The lesson for that, I think, is don't argue with the grannies ever. So I'm going to move straight into our question and answer. We've got loads of questions to get through, about 20 minutes to do it. So I'm going to take them in groups of 3. First of all, Emma Sandry. There are 12 schools in Llandairn and Pentwyn, 2 of which were part of School Street schemes before the summer. However, the situation with traffic is back to normal, even with staggered start and leaving times, despite more people working from home. What action would the panel suggest for tackling these stubborn habits in an area with such a high concentration of schools? Second question from Hamish Belding. ANPR cameras being used at pick-up and drop-off times. What are the streets like outside these times? Are there implications encouraging active travel with time-limited schemes? Third question, Wendy Breach. Hello everyone. A new high school with huge amounts of parking on campus itself is being built in Hexham, a market town in Northumberland. 20 buses expected each day to ferry students from the villages. We want the buses to stop further away in bus stops and lay-bys, park and strides as we call them at Living Streets. But the suggestion has been rejected because of safeguarding. How can we persuade the school and local authority to create a traffic-free school street? So some pretty chunky questions there around school streets, ANPR and traffic around it, and behaviour change. Who would like to go first? Sophie, can we have your thoughts on those 3 questions, please?
Yeah, so I mean, I think obviously I'm not sort of I'm not the technical person here, and you guys are the experts, but I think in terms of the first question, I think I'd be asking, what does the wider area look like around those schools? Because I think it's not just about having the street in which the school is in as a sort of safe route and closed off, but actually are the routes from from where people come from their homes, from where children and parents walk, are they safe routes? Are they walkable? One of the things that I've been proposing in my manifesto for the future, which I launched this week, is that the government should adopt the concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods. So the way in which we plan and design our communities are based around us being able to walk, cycle, or take public transport, to do anything you need within a sort of 20-minute ride or journey, if you like. So I think that there's potentially some things there around the council looking at some of that. I think there's also this, it's an issue of cultural change, isn't it? Is it embedded in, in what the schools are, talking about to their pupils, what pupils are going home and talking to schools about? Certainly from the perspective of my own children's school, there were prizes for scooting, there were a whole range of things, and the children were nagging their parents, I don't want to take the car, I don't want to take the car. And that was really, when you're nagged by children, it's always incredibly effective. Just going on to the... sorry, I'm just trying to find the second question. Perhaps someone else.
Oh, I've just deleted it. Sorry, that's my fault, because it's been answered.
Okay. Yeah, shall I pick up on the second one? I think, Sophie's points are all very well made about Llanedern and Pentwyn. I think the question I'd ask is there a that was very good, Mary, honest. Is there a difference between the 2 school street schools and the other 10? And if there is, how can that be leveraged, and how can then further support be given to the other 10 schools? Because obviously traffic couldn't have returned to normal if the school streets are still in place, because you'd have the council earning thousands every day in fines, I suspect. But so there's a question there. Outside of those times, I think what you find in certainly in the residential areas, that the busiest traffic is during those sort of that hour before school and an hour of pickup time, and therefore you're reducing traffic significantly on those roads, but you're also encouraging people to make active travel part of their lifestyle. So you will see children who are in active travel schools far more readily out scooting and cycling with their parents, because it's part of what they normally and naturally do. It's sort of norming walking and cycling, and sort of making jumping in a car for a short journey abnormal, if you like. And so those are the challenges there. Hexham sounds like fun. I think there's probably a need to take a big step back and ask, how do you succeed in building an active travel secondary school in an area where you've got lots of people who will be traveling some distance into that school? And that sounds like a great project, but it's a big set of questions that probably aren't answered by just shifting the buses a little bit further away from the school, I suspect.
Yeah, I think the last question was about the ANPR cameras being used at pick-up and drop-off times. What are the streets like outside these times? Chris, do you want to come in on that very quickly?
Yeah, I can do. I was just going to pick up very quickly on Dafydd's last point, and I think you mentioned earlier the frustration with planning, particularly with secondary schools. They have the look of a large transport interchange, most of them. One of the things we did just with a particular secondary schools was we looked at the balance, even in the most rural of secondary schools, of active travel and transportation, and it was still in favour of, there were still large chunks of people, more than the majority, walking or cycling. So that has to be put right in there at the centre. And there was an example I can share with you later where a school was rotated 90 degrees on the plan to put the car park at the side. So just to say on that one, there are ways through it. In terms of the way that school streets are set up and the technology, we've seen a wide range of solutions, some of them creative, to looking at how they can sort of be enforced. The first thing on enforcement is, if it's done really well, you won't need it. In Edinburgh, they only put the school streets programme in where they already had, I think it was upwards of 80% resident response being positive to the school streets going in. So in effect, working with the willing. And I think the less technology, the better. But if you are going down that route, then I think it does lend itself to sort of, to more enforcement if you can put it in there. But the first point to make on that is that if you can get the community consultation right and the support locally, then hopefully that's not always necessary.
Okay, thank you all very much. I'm going to come on now. There's particular questions for Caro and the Cardiff context. So Peter Bell says, thanks to Caro and the team at Cardiff for the support they've given Roath Park Primary School. I managed that one a bit easier, dealing with the traffic problems outside the school. CCTV is now in place. School Street much calmer. Most of the school rush traffic has been pushed to surrounding streets, which are even busier than before. How do we provide safe, active travel routes from people's doorsteps to the school streets? Second question from Stuart Power. Are councils looking at alternatives to camera managed school streets? My children's school is situated among many residential streets and lanes. Because of the numbers of cameras needed to cover all entrances, the school would be unable to take part in the school streets scheme. So that's quite a difficult philosophical issue. And then a question from Katie Miles from South Gloucestershire. They've got school streets, but they've got a set of problems. They can't enforce them because they don't have the powers to use enforcement cameras. They're using bollards in the road. We need to get that granny in Scotland down. So the school has to put it up and take it down at the end of each day. There are no bollards that they can find that are completely suitable. They've got issues with disabled access. The school doesn't want anyone driving, but disabled parents or children aren't able to walk or cycle. How do you combat this? I would say from my Hackney scheme that disabled children, blue badge holders are exempt from school streets schemes, school streets schemes. Caro, do you want to go first? There's a few Cardiff issues, a couple of Cardiff issues there, and then maybe we'll bring Sarah in on some of the other issues.
Thanks, Mary. And I've picked up on some of the questions. There's quite a few, and in terms of the detailed stuff that might be dealt with outside of this meeting, and anyone can get in touch with me or the team on those things. But I guess one thing, and it might sound a little bit wishy-washy, but it is a journey, isn't it? You know, so where we've done the school street scheme, it isn't going to solve everything overnight, but it's making a kind of break with the norm. And I think actually there'll be knock-on things that will need to be done. It might be that this links in with low traffic neighbourhoods or the wider thing, but we've made a break, and we've made a break that's going to show positive results of the children being happier. You know, who can argue against those things? But I guess the other thing I would say in terms of how we make them work is to make sure they're tied in with all those, you know, as many of those other things we're talking about as well. So I talked about the living streets, the WOW scheme, and the walking buses. You know, it's bringing that to life. So we're making the most of the opportunity, which I think Chris talked about there. So we've closed the street now. Let's make the most of that. But I think there'll be more to come. I think we'll end up. I could easily see a situation where this will just be the law in 5 years' time, that you won't be allowed to cycle in any streets around schools at that time, or we'll drop it to 15 miles an hour, etc., etc. So I think it's part of a journey.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Any comments on the question so far?
I think the main thing for me is that we need to empower our children. I won't name names, but our school was particularly bad prior to lockdown, with cars and people, you know, driving their children to school. And there's a Welsh rugby player who takes his children in his Range Rover to school. And my 6-year-old stopped and looked at him and said, "Well, you should know better." I don't think any other parents would be able to do that, but children are able to. And, you know, she goes into school and she says to her friends, "If you walk with me, we can do this. Tell your parents that we need to walk." You know, it's back to what Sophie's saying. If we empower our children, that nagging really does work.
Has he left the Range Rover behind then?
Hopefully, yeah. And, you know, a positive thing we have noticed at our school, a lot of different, a lot of people, a lot of faces at the gate that you wouldn't normally see, because we're able to work differently. And it's just being a bit more creative. So we have 2 drop-offs at 2 separate schools that are, you know, a swift 15-minute walk between the 2 schools. At the end of the day, because of the changes to the school day, there isn't enough time to get from one school to the other. So between a load of parents, we've said, right, you know, I can take 4 kids and you can wait at the other school for, you know, the children to come out, and we can deal with it in that way. So it is just thinking a little bit more creatively, really.
Fantastic, thanks. Chris, do you want to just come in quickly on this bollards business, and what do you do if the school's in 3 different streets? How do you make all that work?
It's interesting. Yes, it goes back to the sort of technical aspects again for the the signage that I'd put in there. And it's interesting. One of the rural authorities we've been working with recently were looking at completely unelectrified signs. So a lot of these signs are automatic. They'll come on and off at certain times. That involves another level of planning and implementation, but one whereby the school, and this is implemented I think in Midlothian, where they have a board which is a bit like the flip down board on the back of a school bus, where you flip it down and it reveals a slightly different sign. The idea being that someone from the school could go out and do that morning and afternoon. Now the interesting thing is the schools that were approached for that were actually really keen, in that it gave them a level of ownership that they didn't have with signs that were automatically switched on and off from elsewhere. They suddenly felt that this was their equivalent of the granny hauling the sign out of the hedge. So it's interesting that low tech can actually be quite effective in this way, in that it does something else more than just the technology. It actually gives people that empowerment. So that's something potentially on signs. Things that move in the road are another thing entirely. Bollards and things swinging about. It's you know, gates and such like. It gets very complicated. So I'd suggest start at the lower end and work up towards what is necessary.
Okay, we're going to go to our final round of questions. We've got various anonymous questions that I'm going to put. So first of all, what's the most common backlash public arguments against school streets in implementation, and what are the best ways to address it? What's the solution in rural areas where the journeys involve A roads and where public transport is limited? I think this is a really important point. The government's bus strategy is coming out at the end of the month. And a question from Family Drain. I'm not quite sure, and that's a drain, D-R-A-N-E, not drains for the water. How to prioritise if those who go to the front of the queue, those who ask go to the front of the queue, how do we overcome structural inequality? So the social justice piece, where the schools that may need a school streets may not be the areas which are getting them. I think there's some quite interesting things there. Dafydd, do you want to have a go at a couple of those?
Okay, I think the structural one is that you've got to plan out school streets. And I think it's great that there are a whole range of schools bashing at Caro's door in Cardiff, but they're equally needed in Merthyr and in Rhondda and in Ceredigion and in a whole range of places. And the council needs to have an overarching strategy in those areas to develop in the most suitable areas. There's an interesting one about rurality, and particularly with primary schools. I mean, there's this thing, oh, everyone has to go by motorised vehicle to a primary school in rural areas. Actually, in rural areas still, children live within a cycling distance or a walking distance. The vast majority of children will live within the walking or cycling distance to a rural area. Because even in rural communities, what you've got is a cluster of population around a village, and then some outliers. So what you need is that safe route within those kind of denser clusters of population, and then opportunities for those coming from further afield, maybe to park and stride or whatever else. So I think we need to crack rural safe travel to school actively. But I don't think we should be afraid of saying, actually, it is a realistic prospect to put the infrastructure and the choices in place so that the majority of pupils in rural areas can travel actively to school for at least part of their journey.
Sorry, I've muted myself. Sophie, I just wondered if you had any final thoughts on these questions around sharp-elbowed people getting into the social justice piece, but also how do you overcome the backlash? What are the best arguments?
Well, I mean, I actually think that, local authorities across Wales should be targeting for these sorts of measures those communities that have the biggest need. So, in Cardiff, it's been really interesting that there's been a secondment of a public health consultant into the council to help with some of this work. And there's been some really interesting mapping that's been done around those areas who have living in areas with the highest levels of air pollution, the lowest levels of life expectancy, and surprise, surprise, they're also the most socioeconomically deprived areas. So actually, I think it's incumbent on us to target our resources at those areas first, because we get a bigger set of benefits when we do that. I also think, however, that it's important. I'm going to sort of touch a little bit on a previous question as well. That actually, that we walk, literally walk in the shoes of the people that we're trying to influence to do different things. So I think there is something about, perhaps spending some time with these communities, perhaps not just in focus groups and so on and through paper consultations, but actually, how do you get to school and why don't you? Why don't you take advantage of this? And sometimes it can be some really kind of simple things that we perhaps won't have thought of, but we need to be asking people, what would break down these barriers. And then I agree with Dafydd in terms of rural communities. It is more complex, but I don't think it's impossible. I don't think we should be saying, oh, we're just, this isn't applicable for rural communities at all. I think we need to look at a range of different solutions there, but certainly the kind of safe routes to cycle and walk has got to be a key part of that.
Okay, any final thoughts or comments? Thank you, Sophie. Any final comments from you, Sarah?
I just wanted to add something about the backlash, and I'll hold my hand up. I've been part of that. When I like to cycle to work, to get two kids to two different schools and cycle to work is really difficult. But what I think we need to do is offer up solutions. In Cardiff, for example, there's the Next Bike scheme. That's really great, but there's no children's bikes. There's no bike seats if you wanted to take a toddler on a Next bike with you. You know, why aren't we talking about those solutions as well? Thank you.
Fantastic. That's a very good point. I always found making them jog alongside the bike was the route to get them onto the school cross-country team, actually. So it's a win-win. Yes. Chris, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I'd just say it's certainly very positive to have taken part in this today. And I think, you know, the momentum is there with it. I don't think we're not at the stage where we're having to necessarily set out the arguments of why, it's how now. And I think we can hopefully look to lots more school streets, whether they be rural or urban, because there's no doubt, I think, that less traffic outside schools at peak times is a benefit to everyone. Absolutely
right. Caro, final thoughts from you?
Just echo that socio-economic point, and actually thank one of the questions you put before from Emma Sandry, who is a councillor in Llanedin, which you know is an area that isn't highly affluent, and we need good people in those areas to point out this, because you're right, the emails and the Twitter and everything I get primarily are from the people that know how to get things done. But in terms of the battles, I've seen some of them. We can face them down now. This is about children walking to school with a smile on the face without getting hit by a car. Like, you can just use that as your argument. Let's remember that as the starting point with any argument. And if people are going to argue against that, then you know you're on the right side of that one.
I think we are on the right side, and I think when you put it as emphatically as that, it's a very powerful argument. It's about the right of the child to have the fun, the freedom, the fitness, and the independence that you get from walking to school. We did have 2 questions pre-submitted. One from Pat Bates, Road Safety Strategy Officer from Torfaen County Borough Council, about the pavement parking task force group, and asking whether Living Streets Cymru and the supported what's been put forward. We were always very clear at Living Streets that we want an outright ban on pavement parking to encourage behaviour change, to ensure consistent enforcement across Wales, and you know, to have an outright ban, we think, is the only way to get clarity and consistency, and we argued that as part of our membership of the task force. The second question we had, again, both of these are slightly off topic, but Jermaine Walsh, Support Officer, Road Safety and Training at Cardiff Council, who asked, are e-scooters the solution to getting people out of cars, or is it a major hazard? They shouldn't be anywhere near pedestrians. They are being trialled at the moment, so they're only legal in those cities that have those trials, Milton Keynes, Middlesbrough. The early evidence from the police forces there is that they are being used and abused down A roads alongside cars, used by children under the age of 18. We are not there on e-scooters, and we're concerned as advocates for active travel that they could end up displacing active travel instead of enhancing it. So I think the jury at Living Streets is still very much out on e-scooters, and we are watching the trials with interest. Can I just conclude by thanking all of you for your excellent questions. We were always going to struggle with such an excellent and rich and thoughtful panel. Can I thank Caro, Sophie, Chris, Sarah and Dafydd for your attendance today, and wish you all a very happy rest of the day. And we will try and answer the rest of your questions live. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, everyone.
See you.